So today we're going to talk a little bit about political culture. And so we're just going to jump right into that, to understanding what we mean by political culture, and then talk about a few ways that we can define a political culture. So what is political culture? So I take this from the Dick textbook. It's a collection of the understandings, values, attitudes, and principles of a community or society that relate to its political organization, processes, disputes, and public policies. Out of a society's political culture come important beliefs and values that structure the citizens' attitudes and expectations towards such basic political concepts as legitimacy, power, authority, and obedience. All right, so the idea is essentially it's those underpinning attitudes and values of a specific community or society, and then that's going to influence how it organizes politics, what kind of conflicts there are within politics, what kind of public policy they're going to be enacting. And essentially it's this underlying latent values and understandings and attitudes that are going to influence all of the other sorts of institutions of politics that we've talked about earlier. So in the Barrington Comparative Politics book, they explain 5 different components of political culture. And so I'm going to go through each of those 5 components to give you a kind of basic understanding of what we mean by political culture in a more specific manner in terms of what sort of questions are we going to be asking. So the first is beliefs about authority. So there's 2 major ways that we might see social elites in our society. We might see it kind of as a top-down view, where those who are elites impose their views or their decisions on the masses, or we might see more horizontal social relations, the idea that there's equality between everyone and between citizens. And obviously there's gradations between those. It's not always, I see vertical social relations versus horizontal social relations. So just to understand, what do we mean by social elites? It's going to depend on every country, every context, every society. So the question that I would ask, who is the social elites in Canada? One could say, our political or business classes. We might say that social elites are less prominent in Canada than they are in other countries. But then again, you can see the fact that Trudeau Sr. and Trudeau Jr. both were Prime Minister. Were Prime Minister. Look at Paul Martin Sr. and Paul Martin Jr., both cabinet ministers, and one does become Prime Minister as well. So we do definitely still have a political elite and a social elite. We can see, top business people who are also part of the elites. And so the question then is, do we see our elites as influencing and kind of imposing their beliefs down on the masses, or do we see more of an egalitarian, horizontal social relations? And different countries are going to have different levels of these sorts of social relations being either vertical or horizontal. The second question is to look at the group versus the individual. So are we interested in collective policies that are going to benefit the largest number of people, or do we want the government to protect individual interests? So maybe the best way to explain this is to look at a few different examples. So first of all, universal health care. Would you say that that is a group or collective interest or an individual interest? We'd probably argue that that is a group interest. The idea being that we all pay into taxes so that everybody can have the same level of health care regardless of who they are. Private healthcare would probably be more of an individual interest in the sense that the individual saves up and then pays for their own healthcare. So we might see it in Canada as a group or collective interest, in the sense that we believe that that is in everybody's best interest, that we have a policy that benefits everyone. So each person takes from the healthcare system what they need, that it's important that for the entire society to have a productive society, so that people are working, so that people are healthy, and that's going to benefit everyone. So let's say a charter right to individual liberties. So obviously that would be an individual thing. So we see a lot of individual rights within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, and in lots of other bills of rights around the world. And so those are more individual. I have a freedom of speech. Sure, it's, protecting the collective in the sense that you hope that that individual is going to be speaking out about issues that are going to be benefiting the collective, but ultimately that's an individual right, and that's what's important in those particular human rights or freedoms, rights that are just based on the fact that you are an individual human, therefore you have that right. In Canada, tackling the gun registry, for example, was that a group or collective, group and collective, or an individual basis policy? So one would say that that's a group or collective policy in the sense that we believe that individuals having to tell us whether they have a gun or not is going to improve the public safety of everyone involved, so that the police can work better. So the police can know where there are guns. Now, of course, the gun registry is its own policy that has a whole heck of a lot of issues. There's a reason that it came across so much scrutiny, but still that could be seen as something that was a group or collective benefit as opposed to the individual right to own a gun that you see, for example, in the United States with the Second Amendment. Funny though, I'm just going to go on a tangent about the Second Amendment. It was originally meant to be a group or collective right in the sense that a well-regulated militia be necessary for the security of a free state or something like that. The idea being that we have this individual right to bear arms for the collective good. But anyway, that's a whole other story. We could talk about the Second Amendment. Ask me about that in class if you want to talk about gun rights in the United States. All right, one more. Tackling climate change. So it's probably a group or collective policy in the sense that, the environment's not just going to affect one person. If we have large-scale climate change, then it's going to affect everybody. So it's not just an individual thing, it's a group or collective thing. So I think we probably get the gist of that. I could go through more examples, but let's just move on to number 3, which is liberty versus security. So are we interested in freedom from state intervention, or are we interested in the state intervening so that we can be secure? And here's where it's important to talk about positive versus negative rights. So negative rights is essentially this idea that the government doesn't interfere. I don't want them to be taking my taxes. I don't want them to be getting involved in what's going on. Essentially, I have freedom from interference. So this is what we would see in the liberty side. So people value freedom from state action. The state leaves decisions to individuals, even if it means less stability and security. The opposite of that is positive rights. Well, not really opposite, but a contrasting idea is positive rights. So I don't really have any rights, honestly, if I'm sick and I'm dying. So in order to exercise my liberty, I need to have healthcare. So we see this as a freedom too. So I need to have this sort of necessary social conditions and level of security and health that I have freedom to actually exercise my freedoms, to be quite honest. So essentially it's this idea between liberty and security, and where does that balance fit? And that's going to be one component of a society's political culture. You can say that certain societies value the security aspect over the liberty aspect, and vice versa. And we could very much ask a lot of questions about that. This is the point where if we were doing this in class, I would kind of go through a few questions that would help you to elucidate where you kind of fall in terms of liberty and security. So some of the issues that might come up is like surveillance cameras in public places, people monitoring financial transactions, monitoring emails, the idea of a national ID card, scans at airplanes, for example, ethnic profiling. So these are all sorts of issues where you are giving up some sense of individual liberty for collective security. And so that's the question is, which ones are you okay with and which ones are you not okay with? I think it's a good exercise to go through, to think through, where do I fall on this spectrum of liberty versus security? Got that from a 2011 poll. So have a think. I think it's worth thinking through these sorts of issues, and that's a key part of political culture at an individual level, but then as we know, culture is generally as people relate to each other, so, and on a societal level. So it's important to think, okay, then how does overall, say, Canadian society, or how does overall RMC culture think about these particular issues? Although some of them you probably, it's RMC being a very specific place, might have some interesting answers. Anyway, so I think we probably get the gist of the idea of liberty versus security. Number 4 of the 5 is political system legitimacy. So does the existing political regime seem to have a right to rule? Can government be trusted? Or is it the idea that society really has to carefully monitor the activities of government? And so we're going to talk about generalized trust in the next video, which is also part of this political culture set of lectures on social capital. So we're going to talk more specifically about trust. The idea is specifically the political system. Do we see there to be trust or ability to see them as legitimate? So I put up the pictures of 3 Canadian leaders. And you can think about, okay, so in terms of Canadian political cultures, is our political leaders trusted? Why or why not? Who is trustworthy and why or why not? And those sorts of questions can elucidate the sense of legitimacy that you might see for our political system in Canada if we were trying to build Canadian political culture. And then the last of the 5 is political community. So it's essentially, how does this political community identify itself? Is it according to race, religion, ethnic group, region, nationality? And then also, is there a strong national identity? And that plays into political culture. So one question I might ask is, in Canada, what would we say is our primary identity? Do we see ourselves based on our nationality? Do we see ourselves based on multiculturalism? We saw that as one potential basis of national identity in the last lecture, looking at diversity and nationalism. And so the idea is, the last set of questions is, okay, well then, what does the population most readily identify with? And does the population have a strong attachment to that overarching national identity? A good activity is to think about your top 5 identities. So I am an officer cadet. I am from British Columbia. I am of a specific religious group. I am from a specific ethnicity. And to think about, where do your different identities, how would you rank them? And then to think also, okay, well, what are the identities that we might say ascribe to the entire Canadian population? So the last question we want to talk about is, well, then where does all of this come from? And that's a really tricky question. It's not something that's super easy to answer. So generally we say that there's kind of 3 ways that political culture is going to get built. So the first is defining events. So there'll be a shock to an existing political culture. So I was reflecting on this for my generation of Canadians. What were the defining events? I think in terms of international security, 9/11, of course. I was in grade 7, I think. I was in grade 7 or grade 8. So anyway, I was a preteen when that happened, and that really defined how I saw international relations and how I saw global security. For at that point in time, terrorism really wasn't on my radar, and then all of a sudden, I was also only probably 11 or 12 or whatever. But then that kind of leapt onto the national agenda. So you can have a shock event that influences how a whole generation will see politics. I think also to the sponsorship scandal, that was coming around, I don't remember exactly, probably early high school or something, or maybe even earlier. So the Liberals had a sponsorship scandal in Quebec. And that influenced how, I saw the Liberal Party, for example. It influenced how a lot of people saw the Liberal Party until Trudeau, and really until 2015. And so there can be a defining or a shock event, or a big scandal that comes out, and that will then influence how people see politics, how people see system legitimacy, how people see the need for collective versus individual policies. So it's worth having, thinking about that. Is what are some examples of defining events in my political life? I often ask the question, if we did this in class, of saying, okay, what's your earliest political memory? What's something you remember about politics, and what sticks out to you? There are also repeated experiences, so a factor that just keeps influencing a country. So something that is less than one shocking event. It's not like one specific thing that happens, but more of a long-term thing that permeates within a culture. So I think of, for example, for me, the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, that was happening, right about when I was starting to think about getting a job someday type thing. And that influenced how my generation saw the workforce, saw, how we relate to the workforce, how we relate to the economy, to the housing market. Or you could see the war in Afghanistan influencing how we see the Canadian forces, for example. So that's a long, repeated experience that over time is going to influence a political culture. And the last thing is socialization. So this idea of transmitting political culture from generation to generation. It can also be, within a generation, from your friends, from your peer group, from your school. And you can reflect on this question, where do I get my political beliefs from? Is it from my parents? Is it from where I grew up? Oftentimes we do talk about our political beliefs being largely drawn from our parents. We tend to inherit partisan identity too from our parents. So it's worth asking the question, where do my political beliefs differ from my parents, and where do you think that might have come from? Is that from some sort of socialization, from my peer group, from a defining event, from a repeated experience? And together, these are all things that build our political culture, and then that influences our political behavior, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. So that's the basic overview, and then we're going to get specifically into the issue of trust and social capital in the next video.